Hello and welcome everyone to Proc-N-Roll, your guide to practical procurement, where we make procurement rock and roll. As always, I've got Natasha, the pro CPO, IBM, McKesson, Salesforce, and most recently Nike. We've got Conrad, the master innovator from Intel to CPO at Adobe, and now founder and CEO of one of the hottest procurement startups, Graphite. And you've got myself, Zach, your expert and consultant on all things procurement. And we join you with almost 70 years of practical procurement experience. And here at Proc-N-Roll, we discuss the latest and greatest trends and topics in procurement. So welcome both. Nice to see you again.
Awesome to see you.
Good to see you. And Zach, yes, the last corporate job was Nike, but for the last 8 months, I've been very thrilled to run the company called Candid Procurement, where we also make procurement practical.
You know, I need to update the entry language right now so I don't make that mistake again. Of course, Candid Procurement, everybody. And today's topic's a really interesting one, contracts, right? Today, a big part of what we do in procurement includes contracts, obviously, and processing contracts and reviewing contracts and negotiating contracts. And in many ways, procurement people are contract people, you know? We're like the paralegals and the contract experts, especially when it comes to commercial aspects. And this takes a huge amount of time and resources from procurement. And it's almost considered to be a BAU. Yes, of course, procurement is going to spend ages dealing with contracts. But we wanted to dive in on the topic today and just kind of get our initial views. And I think what we'll do is we'll follow this episode up with probably a contracts expert, someone with real expertise who can come and give us their view on the latest and greatest. But yeah, I guess I want to start by exploring this idea of contracts and what is a contract in the modern age, you know, and has it really changed at all? Natasha, do you want to go first?
So I think that for as long as there is partnership, there is a contract. For as long as one company buys some goods and services, there should be some agreement on what kind of terms and conditions we're buying goods and services. Because in the beginning of any relationships, marriage or business partnerships, it's all roses and unicorns, right? Everything is charming, lovely, and we're all in complete agreement. But as business develops, relationships develop, the nature of connection and the nature of business can change. And it is beneficial to have some sort of agreement that governs the relationships. Procurement people know that reference to the contract when you have any conflict, it makes the same effect as reference to the policy. Call it heartache, heartburn, indigestion problem, whatever it is. People don't like to be reminded about policies. Equally, people don't like to be reminded about contracts. But nevertheless, having some sort of set of rules and that govern the relationships and potentially govern the contract is beneficial. Hopefully, both sides never have to refer to it. But in case of misunderstanding of any size and sort of, it is beneficial to have it.
Okay, well, let me ask you a follow-up. So should every PO, every agreement you have with providers be backed by a contract? And how much time should you really put into the contract? Because it sounds super important, right? It's like your fallback, you're saying. So how important is it to have
the answer to your first question is no. Not every transaction has to be supported by the agreement, right? And I think that approach to contract is three-dimensional. How much value the contract represents, how much risk the contract represents, and probably less important, but nevertheless important dimension, how much time does it take from procurement and legal and all other supporting functions to bring the contract to life. If the risk is high and value, like total contract value is high, i.e. enterprises' commercial commitment is high and the risk of the relationships is high, then yes, it needs to be governed by the contract. If it's a repetitive transaction of low risk, low value, then you actually need to find the different ways to govern those purchases. And I think this is where contract policy has to be in a very clear connection with payment authorization, because small transactions do not, there should be a transaction, let's say, between $1 to $5,000 that do not require any contracts, any agreements, put on a P card out, right? Then there's a different approach to, let's say, between 5,000 and 50,000. Purchase order should suffice. Like anything between 1 million up with higher risk probably should have an agreement. But it all depends on the nature of the business, the risk that the relationships represent, how much money we're planning to spend with this provider. And we probably will speak later in this conversation about what the company is actually trying to protect when they enter into contractual agreements.
Oh, for sure. That makes so much sense.
You know, Natasha, when you're talking, it just took my mind right back to our policy conversation a couple of weeks ago. Remember when we were talking about the policy and when you do things and how you do things? Because you're talking about the ability to put certain transactions on a corporate card, move them forward quickly. Other ones are treated a different way. Like the overall strategy of how you go about looking at the work that's coming across your desk represents a really thoughtful vision about what you're trying to accomplish that you operationalize back into the business. This is a really big thing to think about. Some teams have transformed their legal and procurement process, and some teams haven't. Just 10 years ago, when I got to Adobe, 70% of all purchase orders coming through the process had a contract document associated with them. 70%. And they had this really, I say they, let's say we, I was part of the team there. We had this process where purchase requisitions were approved up the management chain and the finance chain. And then the contract was put together. And then that contract document went through the same basic workflow for approvals. It was totally redundant, a waste of time and effort. I mean, who approves it? Who signs it? There's a bunch of things to think about, but this is a huge area for optimization. I mean, we've talked a lot about data, supplier onboarding, risk, and all these other things. This area, contracts, really needs some thought. And I think it's a little tricky for procurement people because we kind of sometimes bow down to our legal folks. So these guys went to law school. They're really smart. And by the way, I'm not knocking any of my legal friends. This is true. To go to law school, go through that process, you got to be really smart. You know, but this has got to be more of a collaboration with them than just kind of a do whatever they say thing, because they're kind of working on, like risk teams, they're looking at this from a legal perspective versus an operational perspective in many cases, and it needs a different lens. 100%.
Well, can we side question, can some of this be done by AI, do you think, in the future? Do you think procurement teams and legal teams would relinquish, for let's say contracts, Natasha, between the value of, I think you said something like 10K to 50K or whatever, where maybe you need some kind of document, or maybe more than 50K. AI maybe can just write the contract and give you a approved version, you know, because it's been trained on your policies and your rules and you've got the enforcement.
100%.
Okay.
100%, right? But this is where partnership between legal and procurement is super important. And I think this is I've experienced it with a lot of legal teams, that the initial misunderstanding and initial conflict between procurement and legal is mainly because procurement focuses on spend and numbers, and legal focuses on the risk for the enterprise. And both sides need to realize that we're driven by different priorities. And we had this theme throughout many of our podcasts. The procurement has to stop speaking procurement to everyone around them and really need to embrace the enterprise vision and work with business partners like legal from that perspective. So if procurement embraces understanding that legal guards the company from the risk perspective, then I think the determination of what can be automated can be done very easily. In one of my best partnerships with legal, like my partner told me that we wouldn't mind to put even categories with a spend of $1 million, $2 million on the POs if we define that category of spend as low risk. And if there is no product ownership or intellectual property, something that we as a company have to prevent and protect, because that's kind of like the core of the business, to protect integrity of the brand. All right. So that's important. So I think that this is where, again, understanding our partners is very important.
Zach, you're talking about automation. Can we automate these things? My argument first, and Natasha touched on a little bit there, is eliminate. What can we eliminate of this work? And then let's talk about automating, and then, what's left over, let's figure out how to do that better, faster, cheaper. But I would argue, and Natasha, again, she's touching on it a little bit, there's a lot of cases where contracts aren't even necessary. And I think the future is going to open this up even more. I mean, think about in our personal lives, we go to Amazon and buy stuff. And there's a lot of things you used to do when you bought stuff, but now you go, oh, well, I'll just return it if I don't like it. Like, there's a certain level of due diligence that you're putting into things. There is an assumption of being part of that community that I can expect a certain level of quality or service or support or whatever, or I'm just going to return it. I'm just going to drop it off at the Amazon return center and I'm done with it, right? Like, that changes the relationship a little bit. And, I have in my own business, I have a vision, for example, like an NDA. It's another form of a contract. We're doing these all the time. I can't tell you how many times I'm signing an NDA going, why am I wasting my time with this? Right? This is basically, I agree to be ethical and not, steal your ideas and share them with other people. But it's just like this rubber stamp activity that we're all doing these days around NDAs. And I would think as we come together in a community like the graphite community, there can be some assumed behaviors and expectations that call them, I don't know, warranties or something that are just like, when you're in this community, you do this or you get bumped out of the community. People won't work with you. And I think contracts have the potential of evolving that direction too, with the kinds of things that you expect from each other. NDA being the easiest one to point out.
I 100% understand the sentiment, Conrad. I get it. Makes perfect sense to me that, you're dealing with people deal with people, and, we should be able to fall back on things like trust. But isn't it the case that companies and corporations just ultimately do need to protect themselves? So you always need that bit of paper. And we can talk about what paper, because I think your question is completely valid. Like, I think you said something like 70% of the contracts back in your Adobe days, or was it Intel, were contracts. I mean, what is the right percentage? And then what else can you use? So take this question of contract versus purchase order. You can issue a purchase order with some basic terms on it, for example. You don't need a full-fledged contract. I mean, how do you strike the right balance there? And how do you really convince legal teams and risk teams and executive leaders everywhere that you are protected from all angles, ultimately, without having to create all this overhead of dealing with the contract?
Zach, you're taking a position that says they always have to kind of have a contract, or they always have to be protected. And I think the reality is when it's necessary. We've already talked about procurement cards. We're willing to put certain things on a procurement card. And by the way, that's another network that has an expectation of what's going on. If there's fraud, if there's issues, or if there's problems, like, the credit card gives me protections that I don't have in other places because I'm part of that credit card community and a bank and an organization behind it, right? That's helping me out in those ways. But understanding the risk, like, under what conditions do I have to have a contract, and where will I just wash my hands away from the rest of it? Natasha said, her legal team said, some cases like $1 million stuff, like, it's so low risk, I don't even care about investing that time. But we have in our own businesses, and I see it all the time in businesses where they just have this administrative operational policy built out in their document structure that says this is how you do it, and it turns into red lines back and forth and all this time and approvals and process. And like, I would just say time out. Like, 30 years in procurement, for me, I have had one example where a contract came out of a drawer for a discussion with a supplier. And this is on the buy side. This is not on the graphite side. Because there was a disagreement about the relationship and who was committed to what, and what if, there was, anyway. It didn't get litigated. It didn't get arbitrated. It was just a management conversation that said, we went into this relationship with a certain amount of expectations of each other. How are we going to walk out of this? And we agreed what the walkaway was going to look like. And that was really nice, actually, to have a bit of a framework in place, so we weren't throwing mud at each other for 2 or 3 weeks to try and sort it out, even though it was painful. One time, 30 years. The amount of money, think about the amount of money and hours on the legal side and the procurement side and everything else that goes in this entire stack of agreements that never came out of the drawer. Now, by the way, I want to separate agreement, like the contract, paperwork, from clarity about what you're buying. Like that's a different thing. Like the scope, the expectations, I'm not saying that you have to throw both of those out together, but really streamlining the paperwork is super important.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of companies use like templates, right, for their contracts, and that's an easy way to do it. Like, here's our template. As long as the supplier signs up to our terms, then legal doesn't need to check it. Procurement doesn't need to check it. We're happy, right? These are the constraints that we set. Natasha, I want to ask if you have the same kind of perspective as Conrad here, in your kind of career. Is it just a couple times that you've really had to pull the contract out of the drawer on the buy side?
I'm always looking for precedents to disagree with Conrad, and I can't find that many, unfortunately. A couple of times, yes, and I've been in procurement for 26 years, so there were instances when we had to refer to the contracts, but very, very rare, right? And I think that rarity should also be another factor on figuring out when contract is required, because companies absorb, adapt, and kind of like accept the fact that every day of operation for any enterprise is exposure to multiple risks. And companies openly determine which risks they're willing to take on and which risks that are trying to protect. And what I've also observed is that very often we're in instances where I think legal should take stronger stand and kind of like more dictating stand. They actually just acting as advisors. So they meet with the stakeholders, the contract owners, and they explain their position, they explain the risks, and they explain why they're recommending certain things. But then ultimately the decision on proceeding resides with the stakeholders. And this is where I have mental disagreement with legal, because at some point we all leave the companies, right? We don't stay there forever. So you're basically delegating a decision that is critical to the company onto someone who may not be part of the company when a potential issue may come up. And also that person does not have a legal expertise, and that person makes a decision based often on the factor of what will constitute my speed to market, what will bring me to solution to me buying services or goods faster, because I already have a provider and I need to go with this provider and I want to ignore the risks. And this is where I think we're legal taking position of being advisor and recommending versus kind of like taking a strong stand and directing. I think this is where I would like to see legal kind of like being more assertive. But I also wanted to agree with Conrad's previous point. And sorry, I didn't answer the question you asked me. I got carried away with relationship aspect. I too strongly believe that majority of like tail spend has to be first eliminated and then automated, because some of it does not require anything and some of it can be automated and then outsourced will be step 3. But the first step is always eliminate and then automate.
Okay. How do you, I'm trying to put myself in the position of like a stakeholder, a contract owner. Let's say I'm a senior person in a business, and ultimately, I'm the person who's accountable for things going wrong, contractually. the inertia I feel in a lot of organizations and a lot of teams like that is for execs and stuff to just say, yeah, I want to be covered, because I don't want something to go wrong in my area, right? And make me look bad. So how do you get people to sort of accept a slightly higher level of risk that is non-material, right, in exchange for the value that it would free up in terms of your time and energy and resources that you're sinking into putting the contracts together and negotiating them, checking them, etc.
Zach, I think you're touching on something that that is really important to understand. I mean, Natasha mentioned, and I agree 100% with Natasha, the business very often just says, get it done now. Like, I got to get this project. It's time to market. Like, this is what I care about. You're talking about a situation where the business is like, I'm a little nervous about this thing. I don't think that's their typical position, but if they're nervous about it, put the brakes on the sucker, because now they're like, I don't know, I'm seeing all of these potential risks here. Like, this whole thing needs to be really deeply thought about. I'm not saying stop it, but this is exactly the kind of example where that is where we should be investing our time and effort instead of the 95% of everything else, right? So I do think it's important to think about the stakeholders and their motivation here, right? The business needs to run business and win business. And in a very few cases, they're going to put up a red flag and say, I really need help. Legal has, Natasha, they have these opinions and they want to mitigate the legal risk of these things. Procurement is very often focused on cost and maybe the operational process. I think it's really hard to let any of those people have a veto here. I mean, of course, if the business doesn't want it, you don't do it. But Natasha, you're asking for legal to basically have a stronger stand. I see them like you, very often saying, well, if the business approves it, it's just advice. The business is responsible now. But if you carry that to the other extreme and legal's just saying, no, we're going to put our foot down, you can't do this, then like in the end, it's got to be this come together collaboration where we make a group, not a group think decision, but a group decision, bringing the best of our knowledge and intelligence together to say, this is what we need to do. We need to slow down because there's risk. Or these are the things that we just need to quit wasting our time on so that we have resources to slow down when there's risk, right? But the business, legal, procurement, probably a few other stakeholders, the risk team, cyber privacy, like we need to come together and figure this out.
Well, that's what they do though, Conrad, isn't it? And a lot of companies, they have like forums for contract approvals, right, above a certain value. So I agree with the eliminate, right? So definitely we want to eliminate stuff and then optimize for sure and focus on the big value stuff. But they have these contract approval forums that, you go and you sort of pitch what you're trying to achieve. And, they sort of sense check it. They're not really reading the contract itself. Procurement does that and legal does that, but they're sort of sense checking the risk around a certain topic. But that in and of itself, I've also found that to be quite bureaucratic sometimes, depending on the policies, etc.
I think it's bureaucratic because a lot of enterprises have completely disparate and disconnected systems. And what stakeholders resist more often than not is that they have to fill out two different forms and in two different systems. They have to engage procurement. They have to engage legal. And then and if legal and procurement systems are disconnected, then they have to do this work twice. And they cannot bypass legal, but they can bypass procurement. And this is how very often procurement feels left out. But if it's a meaningful engagement with a third party, legal will bring procurement at the very end. And it's kind of like now we're getting to the core of the familial conflict is that why do you always inform me at the very last minute and now you want my input and I have no time for it, right? So I think that we're going back to the subject, to the notion we discussed during our orchestration series, that the importance of the intake and the importance of having one front door for all purchasing activities. It doesn't mean to have one system because that's not possible. You can have multiple systems, but for as long every engagement, whatever purchase you need to make, pencil or airplane, you go through one front door and then it directs you to multiple rooms.
Yeah, and
I
I'd
mean,
love to dive into it, how we make that practical in the future, right? Like how do actually companies achieve this through policies and thresholds, etc. Sorry, Conrad.
no, I was just going to say that assumes that the organizations in the background, Natasha, you talked about the family drama and all the other stuff in the background. I see a lot of dysfunction between legal and procurement teams. I do see cases where they're really working super well together, but I see a lot of dysfunction. And when I arrived at Adobe, I actually remember sitting in a room and one of the senior staff reporting to the general counsel said, anything that's important, we need to negotiate, because legal negotiates better than any of you procurement people. Kind of like, you don't know what you're doing. You're not good at this thing. And you could see by the way the operation had been built, that it was built around these perceptions of who has the strength, who has the experience, who should be doing these things. But at the same time, legal had not allocated resources to work on procurement. So you'd have all these supplier agreements coming through, and they were backed up behind the revenue agreements. And it's just take a ticket and wait in line. Like, you're going to be deprioritized forever. We took that dysfunction to a very deep and productive partnership where we both work together to transform the process and call it the policy, the backbone of what goes into the orchestration that Natasha's talking about. Because if you don't do that stuff first, like fix the dysfunction, align the process and the policy requirements, and then build that into your front door and your orchestration, you're just going to automate a giant mess, and everyone's going to be unhappy.
But that sounds like a culture thing to me as well, Conrad, right? Like, it depends on if teams really get along, and if they're, what the culture like is in the business. And if people are always covering themselves, then I think you'll tend to get more bureaucratic processes and systems, etc. But I think we're all in agreement here that, this is a huge opportunity for procurement and for the whole contract process to sort of change and evolve. And I'd love to deep dive into that.
Zach, yeah. I've got to ask you, right? You're seeing a lot more companies than Natasha and I are seeing. Like, how are you seeing contracts being looked and worked at across the engagements that you have, the many companies? Where does this fit in the priorities, and what do you see as maybe the top 3 things that KPMG, you and your team bring out as you are helping teams through these challenges?
I think the contracts are seen as a bit of a pain point, especially on the tail side of your spending, right? I've seen a lot of companies, organizations I speak to are always their teams are struggling with, the volume and the paperwork, documenting everything, storing everything. A lot of organizations now starting to outsource some of that stuff. So the whole kind of contract management side of it outsources. They could free up some of their more senior category managers to just work on bigger topics and bigger contracts, etc. What was the top 3 question? Kind of top 3 things.
Yeah. So what are the top 3 things you think about when you get in and work with a team? That these are the 3 kind of steps I would take if I was looking at an organization. It's interesting, by the way, that you talked about the outsourcing of that. By definition, almost that. So this is a low risk administrative, just like Natasha added as her 3rd step, right? Eliminate, automate, and outsource. So I think that's on the first 2 steps first, that's good. But when you go into a team and you see their contract work and their operations, what are the general 3 things that you guys are suggesting or implementing most of the time?
They definitely fit the chain that we've just described around eliminate, optimize, and focus on the bigger, more strategic stuff. So it'll be things like, are you using templates where you can of all your different types of agreements, right? So that you can automate that. It's also about reducing the demand being channeled to new suppliers. So it's not just about contract management, but it's about fewer new contracts being requested, right? And having more contracts available for people to use. And so I really think we always need to look at it holistically. But I think the general theme that we're talking about here, that it feels very administrative and heavy, that is something I've seen over and over again in many businesses. And I think procurement still sees contracts such a big part of the identity for procurement people, right? And you know what? I understand why, because it's a very hefty artifact. I know we're saying we don't use it that much, but it is important. It does demonstrate power, and it's like a instrument for procurement, right? To say, you know what, I can control the contract here, and I can control this relationship a little bit better, and using it as a negotiation sort of tactic. So. I'd say Conrad, I wish there was organizations that did something exactly the same way when it came to holistic sort of contract management, but I'd say the pains are shared definitely across most businesses. Yeah, but look, if we move on just from the simplification.
Before you go there, I got to tell you a funny story, and that is we went through this optimization I was telling you about at Adobe, and the whole time we were going through it, I thought we were saving the company money by taking work off of the corporate legal desk and putting it onto the procurement desk. I later found out, and this might surprise all the procurement pros out there, that we were paying our category managers more than they were paying their not their most senior, corporate attorneys, but their entry-level corporate attorneys were making less money. So I didn't, like, when we optimized it, and then, my friend Lisa over there actually told me, we looked at the salaries, and I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't factor in which of these organizations was going to be more cost-effective in this process. So we, just to control the process back in procurement, because legal, we were kind of behind the queue all the time, just to control it, we pulled it over. And then I was left kind of scratching my head going, maybe I increased the cost of this, and I should have just worked with them to keep that redlining there or whatever with more affordable team members. Like, I was maybe a mistake we made, that this collaboration, the partnership with the legal team can help you avoid. I mean, that was a basic mistake, but there's a lot of mistakes that can happen here if you're not in collaboration with the legal team. We've got to bring a legal expert in here, in the next podcast to help us really talk about this from the legal perspective. Because if you're in procurement and you're trying to solve this problem on your own, you're just going to run in circles. You have to go get a partner on the legal side to, lock arms in, to get to, and maybe that's where you're going with this practical conversation. But I'd say that is step one. Who is the person in legal that's going to help you understand the details and really transform how you're working on these documents?
I agree. It can be such a very powerful synergy between procurement and legal when it works. And so, yeah, we'll look to get someone on the podcast definitely who can dive into that a little bit more for us. But I wanted to move it on because we agree that, the contract management process and contract universe is ripe for disruption and change, right? And optimization. But let's say, you do need some contracts after all. I want to talk a little bit about separation of duties, right? How, it's something that's really emphasized in standards, policies, regulations, all over the place. But I want to ask you guys, what do you think? Should the approvers of requisitions and purchase orders also be the contract signers, or should you always have a separation of duties between those two?
To answer your first question, no. To answer the second question, yes. So no, from my perspective, those who own the budget should not be the contract signatories. I am a strong believer for many reasons that the contractual signature, right, should only belong to legal or procurement. So yes, segregation of duties, I believe, is a must to make a weighted decision that is interest of the enterprise, not of a particular project that business is hiring for.
So do you see that as a separation of duties thing, or just like a policy enforcement thing? Because when I go out and say, when you see wild maverick contract signing in the business, and someone just signs the contract, and they're almost never doing the redlining and all the other stuff that legal and procurement would do in a situation. So if you can just say you can't sign contracts, it's a very clear line that says, almost at a policy level, we have to look at it first. Like, I don't know that I care if that's their ink on the contract, but if it hasn't gone through proper reviews, then I have a real problem with it. So I don't know how to think about it in terms of separation of duties versus just follow the proper process so you have control and compliance. But it is interesting because traditionally separation of duties is the person that orders, contracts, and pays is all the same person. So it could be their uncle or their brother or their friend instead of, really an arm's length relationship. It does kind of play in there a little bit, but I've never thought about this as a separation of duties as much as a proper process and control.
I just think that with all due respect to marketing and HR and tech professionals, they are not trained to negotiate legal and commercial terms. And if they own the power of the budget, if budget resides with them and they have the power of dispersing money, and if they have a power of bringing any third party under any terms on board, then we're potentially creating a situation where many checks and balances will be bypassed. And you're right, yet again, that it is more of, if you create a policy where you have to, like, if you're a stakeholder and the procurement and legal has to be involved in the contract development, specifically for those that are of high risk and significant commercial commitment. But again, revoking the policy, bringing it up every time that you didn't follow the policy, that's annoying, right? So, and considering that if systems are not connected, where contracts resign and purchasing requisitions resign, if the flow does not automatically engage legal and procurement, you have to rely on either people's goodwill to follow the policy, or you have to make yourself as integral part of the process.
But also, procurement needs to be quick, Natasha, right? Like this is the things. If you're in HR or in finance, half of your objection isn't that procurement needs to look at it and review it. It's that I don't want to wait a month for a negotiation and a rewrite of this document. I just want to get on with it. And so, does some of the burden then fall on procurement to ensure really high service levels to get that kind of responsibility?
If we eliminate all transactional low value, kind of like this, if we eliminate stuff and position procurement to focus on critical enterprise important agreements, because legal is as understaffed as procurement more often than not, right? And nobody wants to do low value, less impact work, right? And I think we're wrapping up exactly where we started, of automating, separating the unneeded transaction, building relationships with legal, because while relationships between procurement and finance and procurement and tech are important, I think that the relationships between procurement and legal are vital. If you don't have an agreement on how to run the contract process, you have a massive problem for the enterprise.
Let me interject something here, and that is, I love design and build of the right process that gets us the outcome that we're looking for. I'm passionate about that. I'm thinking about who signs the contract or who does things. And what I see as probably the biggest failure of contracts is the business slaps together an agreement about what they're buying, the SOW, the services, whatever it is. And you get into the relationship and you're at like the 11th hour before you're supposed to go live or something's happening. And the business is like, they didn't execute. They didn't do what I thought they were going to do. Like this isn't, like, those are the most common problems that I've seen back in my career. It isn't, well, the limitation of liability was wrong or the termination for convenience was wrong. It's like there is a fundamental misalignment between the business and the supplier about the expectations. And that is so helpful in a formal contract process. But at the end of the day, like when we redesigned this at Adobe, we did put the business on the back of that. They didn't sign the ink, but they said, this document says what, it is proper. Setting aside all the legal stuff they don't understand. This is the scope. This is what we're buying. So you can't divorce them out of this contract process entirely, because at the end, even though it's hard for them, at the end, like that nugget in the middle when it hits the fan, that's going to come back up on the table for sure. That one always is like, what are you buying? Okay, did they deliver? Yes or no? Well, this is really nebulous. The supplier can easily argue they did what you contracted with, so we have to pay them. Really disappointing, right? So it has to be a cooperation, not just on the purchase order, the purchase requisition, but kind of through the negotiation, the contract. It has to come together.
I completely agree. And it's always in like both parties' best interests to make sure that both of them are super clear on what's being contracted and what the agreement is, because often they get caught up in the excitement and they're like, oh, we'll figure some stuff out later. But actually, no, try and figure some of that stuff up front, right? So you don't run into issues further down where there's a misalignment and understanding. Anyway, I think we can wrap it up. We'll definitely dive into this a bit more in the next episode. But what are our key takeaways? I think we've agreed that contracts are necessary and they matter in some cases, but not in all cases, right? And there is a process that you have to go through to eliminate, optimize, and ultimately, make sure you're focused on contracts and reviewing contracts that really make a difference for your business and are strategic in nature. So thanks so much, Natasha, Conrad. Look forward to having another conversation on this.
Thanks, Zach, for your perspective too. And yes, I agree. We certainly need to bring someone from legal who will share their perspective. That's exciting.
Yeah, that relationship matters. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you all.